So it's my pleasure, our pleasure, to welcome for this second session this morning. So Eric Mandelbaum from CUNY, and he will give a talk entitled "Belief: The Primitive Cognitive Relation." So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun to be here. You know, these smaller workshops are, I think, the only conferences where I feel like you really learn something as opposed to just present and meet people. And for me, I'm learning a ton. I feel like even though we're all in the same field, the cross-pollination of the different ways of coming at this topic is very important. And so in general, I would suggest in a normal talk that you stop me at any point for if what I'm saying doesn't make sense, but because this is being recorded, I'm not going to let you do that. Instead, if you just put a finger up so I'll know, at the end of the talk I'll come back and keep those slides together. Peter's one of my favorite philosophers, and it's really great to go after him, although our styles are, I think, a little bit different, so hope you enjoy the contrast. I'm going to start by giving you more of an overview of where I'm coming from, and less of a set of arguments, more trying to contextualize the way I'm going to approach this question. So here's the kind of overarching question that many of us are engaged in. And the question is, why are we so good at predicting and explaining others' behaviors, or at least their quotidian behaviors? It might be difficult for us to explain certain kind of higher level behaviors. If you know that somebody's father was an alcoholic, will they be an alcoholic? Will they never drink? Okay, that's sort of hard to predict. But for most behaviors, we're pretty good at it. We get some email. The email says that this is the day in the conference where we should be. And then without very much else, we all show up there. If you ask to predict how we did that, from, say, trying to predict where our atoms are, you do very, very poorly. If aliens came down that didn't speak any language and tried to predict how we all ended up in Paris, they would do very poorly. But us having some basic idea of how beliefs and desires work and communication works, and we do this thing very effortlessly, so effortlessly that we don't even realize that we're so good at it. So this is one of the questions, the kind of overarching question that I'd like to answer. So here's the different way of looking at this project. I want to identify a state that appears in psychological laws or generalizations. Whether they're laws or not, I'm not going to be fussy about. Whether they're generalizations or just models, the basic phil science question I'm going to put to the side. And I want it to be something that's sufficiently similar to belief so that we can explain the successes of folk psychology. And what does sufficient similarity mean? I don't know. We'll see it as we go along, and we'll get clearer and clearer about exactly what sort of similarity we want as the project progresses. In doing so, we would do this thing where we find a place for belief in cognitive science, which seems like it's also a basic good. Okay, so let's start by talking about somebody else's plan. This is what was once called the Canberra plan, and the faces are kind of washed out, sort of like I think the plan is. And the idea was to start with this analytic a priori intuition, a set of them, right? What is pain? What we do is we think about pain, we ask our friends about pain, we don't actually ask anybody about pain, we just think about pain and think about what other people would think about pain. And then we build these intuitions up into the generalizations of it. And then we ramsify them, maybe trying to make some synthetic a posteriori identifications with something in science, or, you know, maybe not. Whether the science comes, it doesn't really matter. What we're trying to do is understand folk practices or something like that. So this is the Canberra plan, and in opposition to the Canberra plan, I'd like to introduce a new sort of plan. Let's call it the Manhattan Project. Maybe that's taken. We'll call it the Manhattan Plan. And the Manhattan Plan is just the idea that we want to marry the metaphysics of mental states to a specification of cognitive architecture. That we're not going to eschew intuitions, but we're not going to ignore cognitive architecture, and we're going to somehow have these two things coexist. And I call it the Manhattan Plan because the provenance has all these people that were somewhere around Manhattan doing some of it. So a quick run through of who they are or what they're doing. I think it starts with psychofunctionalism. Jerry Fodor from Manhattan was at CUNY, lived there for a long time. Ned, of course, there too. And the psychofunctional project was something like the view that what makes a mental state, say a belief, that given mental state, is just having a certain causal role. And what causal role is that? Well, that causal role is to be given by certain psychological laws, generalizations, models. And this sort of approach you can see in a lot of different people's work. Starting from the 60s, you see the methodology of like, let's look at the cognitive sciences to identify the state that's being used in a certain way. And there's a kind of narrower program, a program that I myself am pushing and lots of my students and former students are working on. And the methodology is just kind of to look at a broad range of cognitive sciences and to see a state that's being used in a bunch of different ways, under a bunch of different names, and to try to identify the commonalities underlying that state and see if, in fact, there's a natural kind there that we can get some predictive value out of. So that's what I'm going to call the narrow psychofunctionalist project, and that's going to be the characterization of its functional role. Now, I don't think that we're going to get an algorithmic answer to whether the state matches onto the folk state. Again, it's going to be whether there's a certain spiritual similarity between the state we have in the folk version and the one that we find in cognitive science. And this is the sort of program that I think you see lots of people doing. So in perception, you have all these young, excellent researchers who are trying to identify different types of perceptual states, whether it's experience, like Jorge Morales, or you're trying to understand what object files are, like Jake Quilty-Dunn and E.J. Green. They're looking at the cognitive sciences to try to figure out and constrain the metaphysics of states. You see the same thing happening in language, starting with Jerry and coming all the way to people like Nick Perot and Dan Harris now. Similar things happening in consciousness and attitudes, which is what is going to be my focus for the day. So I don't think Manhattan is special. In fact, having lived there for the last year, I can report that it's extremely not special in many ways. But it's also just kind of a place of mind. A lot of people, I think, are engaged in similar projects, especially people here. And I don't think that there's anything particularly interesting about the geography, except that there's a kinship between the Northeast and some parts of Europe, mostly here, in the same way that there seems to be a kinship between the West Coast and England, which eschews using the cognitive sciences for any of this stuff. Okay, so just comparing the methodologies, we have, let's say, the Canberra planners that are starting by running analyses with folk practice. If there's no equivalent in the science, then too bad for the science. And that's going to differ very much from, let's say, the narrow psychofunctionalist program. Not that François would want to necessarily think that he counts here, but I would count him for at least the mental files work. Here's the idea. We look at the sciences, trying to identify commonalities in these states, trying to make sense of the data in a way that oftentimes the data themselves don't just make clear. And if there's no corresponding state, then what we do is we introduce a new one. So let's say you're Tamar Gendler, and you're looking at all of the work in social psychology, and you think, okay, there's no state that's underlying this that looks like any existing state, then you introduce a new one, and you call it a leaf. Now, we can argue about whether this thing exists or not. I'm not a huge fan of a-leafs, but you can't argue with the methodology. That methodology seems rather sound. It's just a way of approaching things. Okay, so that's the background. Now back to my specific version. All right, so why are we so good at predicting and explaining others' quotidian behavior? The answer demands that the folk practice somehow latches on to a cognitive scientific state. And ideally, what we want is not to under or over-explain the variance. That is, people are pretty good at explaining other people's behavior, and they're not great at explaining other people's behavior. Explicit attitudes do a pretty good job at predicting your behavior in certain contexts. Implicit attitudes do a worse job, but still some portion of the variance is explained by these attitudes, given certain contexts, given certain behavioral dependent variables. And what we want is a theory that can explain how people predict those when they can, and all of the extra unexplained variance. We want our state to have certain slippage to allow for the mysteries of behavior to be explained outside of these states. Okay, so that's the project. Now, this is the psychofunctional project. This project started in the 70s, and you probably haven't heard about it in 40 years. Why is that? Well, here is my hypothesis. Here's what really killed psychofunctionalism. It wasn't arguments about chauvinism and liberalism. It wasn't arguments about inverted qualia. It was the palpable lack of proposals. If you asked Jerry Fodor or if you asked Ned Block what the laws of belief were, they would have told you the same thing that Aristotle would have told you. They would have just given you the practical syllogism and then called it a day. And nobody found that particularly plausible because that's not much of a theory. So here is a better way of trying to revive the theory. Here's the sort of thing that I'd want for a cognitive architecture just for belief. Right? We're going to need a different sort of desiderata for each given mental state. Maybe what I talk about here will work for the other attitudes, and maybe it won't. A part of the psychofunctional project is being open to the idea that not all of the states we have in our folk lexicon will in fact have a dual in the sciences. So it might be that belief makes it, but hope doesn't. It might be that doubt makes it, but desire doesn't. We just have to go and look. So here's the sort of cognitive architecture I'd want. One, I'd want a mechanism for transforming distal stimuli into a medium that our system can compute in. That is, a theory of transducers, how we go from something like light impingement to trading into something that our system can work on. And here's what I have to say about that. Absolutely nothing. I don't know how that works. I have no theory about it. It'd be nice if somebody else gave me one. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. But it's part of the overall theory we might want. Here's something else we might want. A theory for how beliefs change over time, and here I have something to say. There is a theory about it that I'm not going to talk about today. I think that you have something like a psychological immune system in addition to Bayesianism. You might also want a theory for how the outputs of perception are turned into concepts in the first place. I have a theory about this too. It's a paper called Seeing and Conceptualizing. I'm leaving it out of here because I'm going to have enough problems without bringing up the word modularity. Another thing we want our cognitive architecture to specify is something like a model for how beliefs are stored. And I've got a brand new one with my excellent graduate student, Joseph Bendanya. It's called The Fragmentation of Belief. And the idea is going to have to come up later when I talk a little bit about where I disagreed with some things François said yesterday. And then we also want something for a model of how the output, the perceptions turn to belief, sorry. This is going to be a theory of belief acquisition. How basic perceptual outputs turns into the beliefs we form, and that's going to be the talk for today. Now, thinking is believing is sort of old, as François said. Dan Gilbert originally wrote some papers in the early 90s, and then what happened? If you ask Dan, he forgot about them because the world forgot about them. He wrote them, nobody cared about them, and then he went on to do such boring things as like making commercials and writing bestsellers about happiness and being a prudential pitchman, and his life turned into a much better thing when he forgot about how beliefs work, instead focused on predicting how people are good at happiness. And then I stumbled upon this and thought, wait, this can give us what we need. The problem was that the psychofunctionalists like Jerry and Ned were raised in linguistics and cognitive psychology. And when you were looking for the generalizations of belief, cognitive psychology and linguistics gave you bupkis. Jerry Fodor didn't believe in social psychology for kind of bad reasons. And coming back to it, we can see that in fact, in the attitude literature and related literatures, we could start to find something that formed what I'm going to say is the backbone of what we could build as a psychofunctional theory of belief. So here is what Dan did to start. The kind of basic paradigm is this paradigm that I've said before, but we're going to use a lot today, so I'll walk through it. So let's call it the Hopi noun task. It's that subjects are asked to learn sentences, some marked as true, some marked as false, of the form an X is a Y. So you're given sentences that you've never seen before, say a sofa is a cloud, and then you're given some truth signal. Either you're told it's true or you're told it's false. Maybe you're told that the ones in red are true and the ones in green are false. Or the ones in green are true and the ones in red are false. Or you're told that the ones in a certain script are true and the ones in a different script are false. Or you're just given the word true or false. Or you're just given the sentence and then given the word true or false 2 seconds later. It turns out each of these variations does make a difference, and it really matters. So you can see this mattering even outside of what we care about. If you're following, let's say, the fake news debate and want to know how to combat misinformation, giving your truth signal with the news versus giving your truth signal after the news makes a big deal. So Dave Rand and Gordon Pennycook has some work on this. And those details really matter and are cool, but are not going to matter for what happens next. So I'm going to gloss over all of them and just assume that we generally introduce these things with a truth signal. If at any point you want to know which one or why, feel free to ask later. Okay, so that's in the initial learning stage. And then in the kind of canonical version, you introduce cognitive load on some trials. Now, cognitive load is also super interesting. There's lots of ways of doing it. The kind of canonical way of introducing cognitive load is doing something really difficult. So I'm going to ask you to count back from 100 by in intervals of 7 while doing another task. It's quite difficult. Doing that task while going 100, 93, 86, wait, what's next? Difficult. On the other hand, other forms of load are less difficult. Say there's a tone task where you have to pick out the lowest tone, or where you have to pick out the saxophone amongst a bunch of different things. And in fact, you can do this with extremely low load, which is deeply, deeply troubling for some kind of political purposes. If I just say, whatever you do, don't look at the camera, merely inhibiting yourself would be enough load to have this work. Subjects are then asked a question like, is a SUFA a cloud? You just turn the original sentence in the testing phase into a questioning sentence. Again, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but they all more or less amount to the same thing. And what you see is that load causes people to misremember falsehoods as truths, but not vice versa. These results are explicable if what you have is a view where accepting is automatic and rejecting is effortful. And load's going to disable the rejecting process. So this is an old tale that I've told many times and you've heard many times. I'm going to come back to it by introducing some new data and talking about what's happened in the interim since I've kind of not talked about this in a long time. So one thing that's happened is the same thing that happens that social psychology is so good for, which is just taking an effect that exists and renaming it something else. So in the last 10 years, we've had the rise of illusory truth, which has kind of been around longer than that, but has just rearisen. So here's how illusory truth works. So question, what happens when one encounters information they antecedently know to be false? Answer, doesn't matter. Prior knowledge doesn't constrain acquisition. So this is one of the first places where I'm going to argue a little bit and push back with what François said yesterday. So here's the effect first. Reading something like "Asari" is the name of the short pleated skirt worn by Scots increases participants' later belief that it's true. This holds even when participants can correctly answer the question, what is the name of the short pleated skirt worn by Scots? So they can answer that question, they know that the answer is not "Saris," and yet merely telling them that raises their probability of saying the wrong thing. That is, it's about 50% of the known falsehoods are judged to be true after a single repeated exposure on a binary true-false test. Why is this interesting? Well, this is very similar to what you might see in the old studies I talked about briefing and pre-briefing. When you tell people, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a test. This test is going to be a test where you're going to pick out the schizophrenics, who looks schizophrenic from these pictures. One person in each picture will be schizophrenic. But here's the thing. None of these people are schizophrenic. I'm not listening to your results at all. I have just determined what your results will be up front. Now let's go through this ruse. And what you see is that the feedback you give people still sticks. Even telling people, I'm about to lie to you, isn't enough to not let the lies seek in certain circumstances. Okay, so I think that these studies are just examples in a deluge that are all showing the same moral. It doesn't matter if information is acquired through language or through visual perception. It's just that rejecting information is just much more difficult than accepting true information. So here is my modest proposal for belief fixation, which is also maybe not the right phrasing. So let's say a humble proposal for belief fixation. The idea is that mere tokening, let's say unconscious activation, causes belief. That is, the second you token or activate a sentence in your language of thought, that sentence is believed. And this acceptance is automatic, ballistic, reflexive process, just like perception. You don't do any work, you open your eyes and there's the scene. Same thing as you don't do any work to believe. You just hear the thing, and poof, there it is. Rejecting, though, is an effortful, optional process, much like thought. Now, rejection is going to be sequentially posterior to acceptance, and here is the kind of diagram that a lot of you have seen before. The idea is that you token the proposition, and then passive acceptance happens. And that, note for some arguments that we had yesterday, tokening the proposition is not meant that you entertain it. There's nothing here that dictates that entertaining is happening. Instead, if there's an entertaining phase at all, it's the sort of thing that's going to happen after passive acceptance, where you can go and actively endorse something or actively reject something. In the past, I've talked a little bit about what the rejection process is. Today, for the first time, I'm going to give you some evidence for what the active endorsement process is and how we can tell them apart so we can get some kind of cool new stuff. So I'm going to turn now to some new data, but the new data I'm going to pose as, this is the part that could be shortcutted by load. The first two parts can't be shortcutted because they're mandatory. And then after you passively accept something, then you can optionally reject or endorse or do neither. And if you do neither, some interesting things will happen. You might think that, for example, the sleeper effect holds, where the longer you just hold a proposition in long-term memory, the higher the credence in that proposition is. Okay. So here's some defeaters. Fluency and guessing. These are defeaters of the core cases of the thesis. The idea that maybe these effects are due to fluency, and that it's not that you believe everything you think, it's just that the things that you were shown before is more fluent, or due to a heuristic that says if you don't know, just guess true. And note that this is the sort of thing that I'll really care about. If the core cases don't hold, well, then what good is the theory? This is different from defeaters of the boundary conditions. For example, what happens for conditionals or embedded conditionals, or how do negations work or predicate negations work. Peter, in a different talk than the one he gave today, has in the past beat me up good over the things I said about negation and about the Spinozan theory and rejection explaining negation. And after trying to argue with him, I think he's right. And, this is how good philosophy and dialectic should go. You say something, somebody who knows more about it than you shows you you're wrong, and then you stop saying it. But it doesn't mean I give up the theory, because the theory had this as a kind of side portion. And the core of the theory are these effects about how belief acquisition and belief rejection works, and less about negation. So I'm very open to you discussing and beating me up over the boundary conditions, in particular because we need to know what they are. It's interesting. It's part of the theory. If we do that, I'm going to be happy to make progress. If you counterexample the first sorts of cases, I'm going to be less happy because then I have no theory. But of course, that itself might be a form of progress. Okay, so let's start with perceptual fluency. Perceptual fluency is this sort of thing. There's a couple different types of fluency, right? I don't want to get into this question too much for those of you who are fluency aficionados. There's, let's say, metacognitive fluency. If I ask you, give me 3 reasons for why you like Paris, you can do that pretty easily. If I ask you to give me 15 reasons for why you like Paris, now it's a lot harder. In the former case, you'll increase your liking of Paris. In the latter case, you'll decrease your liking of Paris, because we have this inference from ease to attitudes. Maybe that's the same sort of fluency as perceptual fluency. Maybe it's not. I'm just going to be looking at perceptual and processing fluency, and I'm making no assumptions about whether there's just one given pile of fluency. Fluency seems to be everywhere. It affects validity judgments, aesthetic judgments, recognition of familiarity. So you can see this in kind of fun ways for beauty, repeated truth as a guide to beauty. Right? Show people the same pictures over and over again, and they like them more. Doesn't matter if they're the ones that are hanging in museums or the ones that you just put on your slides over and over again. People like familiarity. The processing fluency makes people think it's nicer. So here is a study I ran with some of my collaborators, Steve Young, Nick Perot, and Ryan Tracy. They were great. First experiment. We're just going to redo the Hopi noun task with a small variation. What we want is sentences like Athoa is a jaguar and then Nixpam is a tiger. And first study has 92 people. We're just going to counterbalance. It's kind of normal thing. that you would see here. The 20 sentences counterbalance for fluency and disfluency on initial presentation. And then on test, they're all going to be fluent. So we're just having fluency change on familiarization. And the sentences are going to vary in syntactic form and length. So here's one of the variations that we have from the original version. We can't have an X as a Y over and over again, because an X as a Y is, in fact, having the same syntactic form. And you might think that having the same syntactic form over and over again is just another way of inducing fluency. So we'll have to change up the ways that they're worded, which we do throughout it. And here we're going to manipulate fluency by figure ground contrast. So this is a disfluent sim. Gordons are jugs. You can see it's hard to read because you have the white text on the yellow background. And here's the fluent stim. The fluent stim is the same thing, but with the black text on the yellow background, so easier to read. Okay, first take of the results. All you really need to see is that there's a main effect here that's happening for familiarity. That anything that you saw previously, whether it's disfluent or whether it's fluent, is believed more. So truth perceptions are raised whether you saw the disfluent thing before or whether you saw the fluent thing before, when compared to new sentences that you see in test. Half the sentences you see in the test version you haven't seen before, and those, you get this huge effect. Didn't matter if the ones you saw were disfluent or fluent. So it's an enormous effect. The effect size here is an effect size that you rarely see in social psychology, and explains a large proportion of the variance. That's your 0.326. Okay, so look at your Cohen's D here. Cohen's D of 0.88, 0.92. This is an extremely large effect. But the large effect, again, is an effect just of familiarity, of having seen the thing, no effect at all of fluency. Okay. Experiment 2. We're going to do the same thing, except this time, because, we're bored and it would be nice to make contact with other literature, we're going to do some pseudo-profound bullshit. So what is pseudo-profound bullshit? Well, let me give you a taste of what we used. So here's the sort of text we used for pseudo-profound bullshit. A body without organs is not an empty body stripped of organs, but a body upon which that which serves as organs, wolves, wolf eyes, wolf jaws, is distributed according to crowd phenomenon and Brownian motion in the form of molecular multiplicities. The desert is populous. Thus, the body without organs is opposed less to organs as such than to the organization of the organs insofar as it composes an organism. The body without organs is not a dead body, but a living body, all the more alive and teeming once it has blown apart the organism and its organization. So that was Deleuze and Guattari and one of the more poetic versions of pseudo-profound bullshit. Let's go to America for one of the worst versions of this. So here is our most similar bullshitty text I could find. The psychoanalysis of laws. Breast or penis? Do laws nurture or thrust? The anthropology of laws, boring subject, too universal. We don't learn that nature obeys laws. All species have evolved to cope with the same laws. Laws are in our bones. Is this why it is so hard to articulate their human meaning? Colin McGinn. So, was Colin trying to write poetry here? Who knows? This is just some awful pseudo-profound garbage, and these are the stims we're going to use. However, when we used stims this long, what happened was nobody could comprehend them at all, and all of our data was complete garbage, which is the same effect that I get from when I tried to read this myself. So instead, what we're going to use is just single sentences generated by the New Age bullshit generator. Similar study to last time. The initial presentation is going to have 30 sentences, 15 fluent, 15 disfluent. Then we're going to add 30 novel sentences at test, so we can test familiarity versus novel sentences, fluent versus disfluent. And here we're going to have a different font manipulation, Vladimir script versus Calibri. So here is the Calibri, the fluent one. The goal of meridians is to plant the seeds of knowledge rather than discontinuity. It's deep. And here is the disfluent one. The goal of meridians is to plant the seeds of knowledge rather than discontinuity. So you can see it's like quite more difficult to process. Okay, here we get similar data. You can't see as huge an effect because what happened was, again, using bullshit stims kind of makes everybody a little bit confused. You can see the little star there, though, showing that it's significant. Both, same thing happens again. We get an effect just of familiarity, no effect of fluency. The effect of familiarity here is smaller. I'm going to do this one where we collapse over the fluent and disfluent to just have familiar versus novel, so you can see a little bit more. And the same thing happens that we're seeing here, that we get the truth judgments that matter. Here, p is 0.02. And small effect size, again, no effect at all of fluency. Okay, so there's no effect of fluency here in experiments 1 or 2. So maybe our manipulations of fluency weren't working, even though they seem quite strong. So let's try to test that. This is the last experiment in this set. So we're going to test for fluency, not in encoding, but instead a test. This is going to be just like experiment 1. Fluency is manipulated a test instead of encoding of Vladimir's script versus Calibri and 158 participants. So the idea is, if fluency fails in experiment 1 and 2, then there should be no effect of fluency here either, if our just manipulations were too weak. But if it succeeded in experiment 1 and 2, then we should see some effect here also. And here are the results. Again, we get a main effect of statement familiarity, just like we saw in the first 2 experiments. But we do get a main effect of statement fluency here, and that now fluency is being used at test. And we get no interaction effect, which is super important. We have a main effect of familiarity, which is the Spinozan effect. Just seeing it before raises your truth. Finally, we get an effect of fluency. No interaction between them, showing that there's 2 separate main effects. Our fluency manipulation works, but more importantly, you can't have acquisition just be a matter of fluency. So does fluency explain illusory truth? Maybe not. You know, these are just 3 studies. You never want to conclude too much, but it looks like no. When perceptual fluency is decreased, illusory truth persists, and yet our manipulation of fluency was itself successful. Okay, on to the next defeater. And this will get kind of cool to get to the idea of how endorsement works. So down in Mannheim, people think that maybe the Spinozan theory is wrong and the data is due to a guessing bias. I had some other arguments in my old paper about why it couldn't be due to a guessing bias, why there couldn't be a heuristic about it. I went through the anchoring and adjustment data, but apparently it didn't convince lots of people. So they did a bunch of multinomial modeling to make it think that maybe it was guessing. How can we argue against this? Well, some of my friends and collaborators have some new data that would speak against it. And this is Eric Asp. He's another person in the general Spinozan worldview, and he's a neuroscientist that's trying this theory that he calls the Spinozan false tagging theory. The idea is very similar to what we talked about before. The idea is that belief is the true unmarked default. When you believe something, it's just the initial state. Don't have it marked as anything. Only false sentences get tagged, and the goal is to find the physiological signature for the false tag. That's Eric Asp's goal in this study. So here's what he's going to do. He's going to try to separate misremembering from guessing via an electrodermal activity signal, that is, galvanic skin response, that is, how much you sweat. So looking at your sweat to determine how much these different sentences might differ, trying to find a deep physiological signature for truth versus falsity. So remember the model. We have the token of the proposition, the passive acceptance, but we don't have anything for the active endorsement or any evidence for how that works. This is going to be the first time we're going to get some. So again, Hopi noun test. Not much different here. There is a difference in how long the propositions are shown for, and then 2 seconds after you get the true versus false. I only mention this because they seem to stick better when you give the signal after the information and not with the information. Why the truth signal is better when given a little bit after, not yet clear. And then you're tested in the same way. The questions is a Monisha star. Okay, so here are the results. Original symmetry is replicated. That is, you misremember falsehoods as truths, but not truths as falsehoods. And this is really interesting because there's no load here, right? The only load that's being used is being in the study. Nothing, no extra task. But now for some of the more interesting stuff. The EDA data, people correctly remembered sentences as true and false as false. They both have their own signature galvanic skin response, their own signature electrical activity. And misremembering true as false and false as true have different signatures, from having never seen a proposition and judging it as true or false. So, and this is in bold, misremembering false as true is the same EDA as remembering true as true. They're both higher than judging a novel proposition as true. And now I'm going to, this is meant to separate out believing from guessing. I'm going to walk you through this much more slowly to try to make why this is important set in. So here is the kind of suite of responses. The TST just means true sentences remembered as true. The FST is false remembered as true. I'll take it the rest of that's clear. And the not seen is the NS. So here are the ones that I want to bring your attention to. First, note that true is true and false is false. When correctly remembering true is true, you get this high galvanic skin response. That is, it's exciting. And this shouldn't be that surprising, right? When you get information that's confirmatory, when you get information that's consistent with what you already believe, it feels good. This is the overall take of the paper that I vaguely talked about, the psychological immune system paper of mine. Why do people balk at misinformation? Because it hurts. Why do people like confirmatory information? Because it feels good. Note that remembering the false is still kind of high, but not as high. The next kind of important thing, and this is pretty cool, this is a significant difference. The true is still just as high. The not seen as true is high, but not as high. That is, when you haven't seen a sentence, and you confuse it as one you've seen, that you think it's true, you now believe it, that causes less of a physiological boost than when you have a true sentence that you've seen as true. That is, when you're endorsing a sentence. So I think that the top left corner is what happens when you endorse something. It feels that much better. And you see this all over. If you're feeling bad about yourself, what should you do? Well, what we're told to do is find a list of value statements and write what you value on them. Why? Not because you don't know what you value, but because it feels good to remember and endorse what you value. Like, I'm the sort of person who gives to charity. Awesome. That's the top left. And then the not seen as true is not you confusing something that you had seen before, but it's you believing the thing that has been presented to you. So that's the endorsement versus belief. And now here's the super cool thing. The unseen is believed as true. The false is true, and the not seen as true. This is a non-significant difference. That you, if you don't, the unseen that's believed as true is believed to the same degree as the false that you confuse as true. So it doesn't look like you're guessing. You don't have any difference in the signature from whether you're misremembering false as true or you're misremembering something you've never seen before as true. Okay, so the takeaway. Endorsement, belief, and rejection can all be distinguished, oh my God, this would be so cool if it holds, by electrodermal activity. And we can tell believing and guessing apart because misremembering not seen as true and misremembering false as true both have the same EDA signature. And neither are equal to remembering true as true, that is the endorsement part of the model. So there's some evidence against the heuristic guessing bias. Okay, so now my talk was called Belief, the Primary Relation, and I've given you a bunch of evidence that was not on this. Let's go back to the big picture for why we're here. I feel like if I didn't give you any of that other evidence, I wouldn't be giving you kind of new, brand new things. Now let's talk about the go outside and stare at the sun to think about why we would have a system like this. And the idea is that cognition evolved out of perception. Our perceptual faculties were by and large veridical, and the first cognitive faculties just accepted the deliverances of perception as true. I think perceptual faculties are something like modular, but even if you don't, our perceptual faculties are generally giving us a true specification of the world. And what we do is we just take that specification on, and we don't have to mark it as true. True is the unmarked default state for everything that's delivered. And what separates us as humans from the rest of the animal kingdom, maybe other animals can do this too, but one nice way of, everybody has to say at some point, what separates us as humans from the rest of the animal kingdom, having very long fingernails, is the ability to reject information. That's some latter adaptation that we grew this secondary process to not only be able to lie, but be able to detect lies, to realize that there were certain things that weren't true in our environment, where, in fact, before this, almost everything was more or less true. The suggestion is that what was true in phylogeny is true not only in ontogeny, but also in processing. So one of the questions I had for François yesterday was what the conceptual priority was when we're talking about conceptual priorities here. And the idea that I have is I'm not sure what conceptual priority means. It's not meant as an objection. But what I think is we see this in phylogeny, that first we can accept before we reject. You see it in ontogeny, this is how that kids are gullible and then they become less gullible. And you see it in processing, that you accept the thing before you reject it. One other thing to point out here is yesterday there's a bunch of talk about the judgment first. I take this to be a judgment-free zone, that what we're doing isn't judging something as true, but having truth be the default. And judging is this sort of thing that we do later to either endorse the thing or reject the thing. Now, my suspicion is that this is a lot of kind of talking past each other with terms that don't really matter and that we're not going to be disagreeing. But just in case, I'm going to flag it in case we want to disagree on it. Okay, so now here's a picture of someone I'm sure you did not expect to come, and that is Dan Dennett. Why would I put Dan Dennett on here? In general, I would only put Dan Dennett on here to scream about how instrumentalists never make good on their promise for how things work. But not in this case. We're talking about belief, but I want to talk about Dennett's theory of consciousness, which is doubly weird because I have generally nothing to say about consciousness. But here's why I'm bringing it up. Dennett's got this idea of a fame in the brain model, where consciousness has all these agents, or representations, I don't really know why he personifies them, that are screaming to be heard, right? That each representation's trying to make it into consciousness, pushing their force, trying to have their say. I don't know if that's right, but I like this model for the way belief works. That these similar morals are going to actually hold for representations and behavior generation. That what you do is you take in all this information, you believe it all, and what is it to believe it all? It's that the information you take in is pushing itself on you to act on it. Now this picture has, I think, a lot of beautiful things for it. One beautiful thing is it's the exact sort of picture that Dennett could never say, right? Because what matters is activated representations that are pushing themselves on you, not fictions that we're pretending other people have. But if you take this system on, what you have to say is you get this other problem, this kind of deeper problem. And the problem is, how do we produce rational action out of this blooming, buzzing confusion? And my answer is that we tame this architecture by introducing fragmentation, by having a fragmented architecture where only a small subset of beliefs are ever active at once. The rest lie quiescent. And the ones that are activated are then shouting to get control of your behavior. That you have contradictory beliefs all over, and we deal with this way of having contradictory beliefs by sequestering them. So there's been some talk of cancellation, and I've been very worried about this talk, insofar as the idea that you can erase a belief is not something I think happens. I think what we do is we take beliefs and we sequester them. We move them outside of the realm of, we take out its inferential connections, we do our best to cut its associations, but we never lose them completely. If you once believed in God and you no longer believe in God, what you can do is you can make that belief have fewer and fewer inferential connections, but you can still see it arise once in a while because nothing ever gets erased. We have some other things we can do too. We introduce kind of fancier decision theoretic processing of the system 2 variety, Bayesian updating. And of course, there's other things we can do, inconsistency detection through dissonance theory, and Mercier and Sperber style epistemic vigilance. They're not going to agree with anything I have to say because they want epistemic vigilance to be about arguing with other people. In this case, epistemic vigilance is going to be about other people serving as a signal to be skeptical. Okay, so starting to wrap up, in sum, why is belief the primary relation? All truth-apt representations appear to be believed in the first instance. Believing isn't marked, it's just a default stance. And then you can reject or endorse, and they'll have their own physiological signature. If you don't reject or endorse, they might just increase anyway through sleeper effect. Just coming back to wrap up to the bigger picture morals that we had to start. Are these beliefs? Well, look, they have some of the core properties of beliefs, even if they're not essential. They can be true or false. If it's a belief, it better be truth-apt. They interact with something like motivation to cause behavior. They serve as premises and inferences caused by perception. Whether they have the rest of these properties, I don't know. But one thing I do want to say is, this is real progress. And this is progress of the narrow psychofunctional sort. So what I've done, and what my students have done, and what other people have done, is we've looked at these things that are called attitudes, or the placebo effect, or basic conditioning paradigms, or semantic associations, or expectations. And when you look at them all, and you see how they work, you might think, wow, what's really interesting is that they're all just beliefs. These are just beliefs being used under different words by different people. Can we find a theory that unifies them all? And I think we can, and I think we have. And just to show you the fecundity of it, when you do this for here, here's what happens. So I did this and argued that implicit bias has propositional structure. Why does it have propositional structure? Because implicit attitudes are just beliefs. Why are they just beliefs? Because they're just like anything else. So what do people say? They said that you're an idiot, and all these things are clearly associative, and stop saying this thing, and it took me ages to get this paper published. And then what happened was nothing. It was ignored. And then what happened was, oh, wait a minute. People started paying attention. And look what happens next. Repeated evaluative pairings, evaluative statements. How effectively do they shift attitudes? Answer, very effectively. If you give people evidence in language, it shifts attitudes. Okay, well, how effectively can implicit evaluations be updated? Using evaluative statements after aversive, repeated evaluative pairings. And what happens is the evaluative statements have much more of a hold on behavior than any associative pairing. And okay, wait, attitude change via repeated evaluative pairings versus evaluative statements. Shared unique features, again, what matters isn't how many times you pair them, it's the information you give. So if you say, I'm gonna give you group A and a negative thing 500 times versus just telling somebody A is negative, the latter has more control on the attitudes than the former. Okay, but what about this? Oh, he did what? This, oh, sorry, this is cut off. What this one says is, he did what? The role of diagnosticity in revising implicit evaluations. If I tell you that this person did a million terrible things, and then I give you one sentence explaining why he had to do all these terrible things for good reasons, you flip your attitude. Similarly, the impact of valence, verbal information on implicit and explicit evaluation, the role of diagnosticity, primacy, and memory queuing. It turns out that diagnostic information changes your implicit attitudes. Similarly, getting your information from certain sources changes your attitudes. Similarly, evidence from what other people think changes your implicit attitudes. And lastly, just to go straight for the jugular, implicit evaluations are accurate for propositional inferences, meaning give people logical interventions, and it will change their implicit attitudes. Why is this cool? Because forever people thought, no, implicit attitudes just work the way that Skinner would have thought. It's all associative pairings. But if we do this real interdisciplinary work, trying to marry what we think beliefs have to be. Yesterday, Peter was asking, do you think beliefs have to be truth-apt? Yes, they have to be true or false. Why does that matter? Because then this sort of information will change, evidential information will change the structure, and we can convince some people to start looking at it, people who antecedently thought that I must have been crazy or wrong, and now we've actually made progress on a problem. Hopefully we can make more progress together. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. Since you so nicely began by giving like your background or the perspective from which you're coming at these things, let me also just very briefly say how I approach it. You know, so I like to think of myself as being a Manhattan or East Coast guy insofar as I hope I'm open to empirical evidence and looking for it, but I'm also a bit of a West Coast guy, more precisely a Searlean, basically, about these things. So I'm thinking that this talk about computation and all this kind of stuff, to me, it's more like anthropomorphizing brain processes. So it seems to me it's like kind of like to ask what program is the brain implementing. It's more like asking what was God's plan for evolution for the world or something like that. So and it seems to me that, of course, if you make a decision that you're going to use such a framework, you can couch empirical findings in it and seek for ways of explaining it, but it doesn't seem to me that there's really an empirical argument that this is the correct way to look at what's going on in the brain. It seems to me at crucial junctures, so people like Fodor and others, they say, yeah, it's the only game in town, and we want certain things, and that's the only way to get them, so that's why we have to do it this way. But that's not really an empirical argument. So in this spirit, let me ask you, so, I mean, I really like the Spinozan view, and there are many ways that you stated that I would totally subscribe to. Like you said, this is like the default mode of functioning, and I think, yes, it is just harder for us to reject. It takes some effort, and so you can show this by putting people on load in various ways, and it's just kind of exhausting also if you know, that's part, I think, also what exhausts people about the fake news and these things, that you're being bombarded by these things all the time, and you have to really work to reject it, and this kind of exhausts you. But it seems to me, why isn't it enough if we just say that? Yeah, if we just say, okay, it's the default mode of functioning of the mind is to accept something, and we need reasons or special effort to reject it, but we can't. It seems to me we still can. Yes, I mean, I can see why if you start from the premise that you need a computational model, then maybe you would come up with a computational model where you write something like, you know, there must be this process that you call passive acceptance, but do you really think you have an empirical argument for this step?
That is just like such a helpful question. Thank you so much for it. I do, and I'm going to say a lot of things. So first, let me say that, you know, it's always funny who your friends and enemies are. In this group, I think that the MIT Bayesians, who in general argue with me, we are very close together in this sense, even though we're arguing about many things. And here's the sense in which we're close together. They would be horrified to hear me say that, because they'd be like, no, you didn't give me, I didn't give a computational theory of anything. I gave you a specification. They want the algorithm. And here's the sort of algorithms that they'd want. I'm going to change the topic a little bit to make it something that's more readily understandable, I think. If we're doing face perception, you want to know how we're doing face perception. What we know is, for humans, we do face perception roughly by doing a holistic mapping of your eyes, nose, mouth. That we get this golden triangle, and that the ratio of these three things are what matters, and not the rest of the size of your face. And we know that that's not how excellent computational face perception works for computers. We know that our face perception works this way because, you know, you get, for example, inversion effects. So if you've ever seen the Thatcher faces, Thatcherized ones, you take a face, put it upside down. It's hard to tell when you've done things like put the eyebrows on the wrong side or inverted the eyes. You can't tell those things because a different mental process is holding when you invert faces. Similarly, if we're going to look at numerical cognition, people are extremely good at telling numerosities of 1, 2, and 3. There's 0 time it takes. But then if I asked you, for example, what's bigger, a group of 6 dots or a group of 7 dots? You're slower on that than saying what's bigger, a group of 6 dots or a group of 10 dots. The size difference between the two sets dictates speed. Similarly, the size of the distance between them dictates speed. So 2 versus 3 you're quicker on than 4 versus 5. 6 versus 10 you're quicker on than 6 versus 7. Now, we have to model that behavior. The weird thing that happens for some of this stuff is that you have a logarithmic compression where the earlier numbers are greater represented, and then the representation becomes much, much fuzzier as we go up. And now we can talk about how that error comes. And that error is going to be error that maybe you think is due to scalar variability, or maybe you think is due to something else, but we can make a computational model trying to model that error. And whether that is, the better that explains behavior, the more it seems like, well, that's what we're doing. How we're doing that, what circuits are doing that, is a question that we still want to know, right? We really want to know how the brain implements these functions. But which function it is that we're implementing seems like a real question that really matters. And the Bayesians would say, for all types of learning functions, both in language and elsewhere, that they're trying to get something like a computational model of what they're doing, but they're moving towards the algorithmic model for how the brain's doing it. And it's just, on the one hand, a matter of faith that the closer we are to the description of the behavior with this mathematical model, the better it is, footing we have for saying that's what we're doing. But that's just what we do in most sciences. You know, you make a model, the model explains something, you take on the posits of the model. They would disagree with me here because I haven't given you anything that's computational in that sense. And I think, well, you know, that's what happens when you're in earlier science. The computational stuff comes later. So even though we can't say for most things how the algorithm's implemented, I don't think it's just faith. One more point on it is for the numerosity stuff, when I used to be up on it, and single cell recordings were happening in monkeys, you could see the earlier computations that there were, there's a Nieder and Miller paper from 2001, so a long time ago, that populations of neurons were responding in the way that we think the accumulator model works. So there'd be certain neurons that were just responding to oneness, and they were very precise responding, and then it would be a greater population that was less clearly responding the higher you went up, creating a fuzzier signal for the fuzzier representations of numbers. And something like that would be the Holy Grail. We're in the medieval times for cognitive science, but what can we do? You know, that's when we're alive.
Okay, but you have been in it for a long time, right? The medieval times.
I know, it's a hard problem. We're going to die and still be in it, I'm sure.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric. So this is a question just by way of clarification, or maybe asking you to draw out some of the implications of the theory a little bit. I'm just thinking about cases in which it's really about individual differences. So I'm just wondering, you know, the intuition that some people are more gullible than others seems to have something to it, at least in my common sense experience. So I'm thinking about, you know, watching fictional films. Some people will walk away from them and not be able to tell whether that's true or not. It doesn't even occur to them, or maybe the question doesn't even arise. I'd like to think that some of the rest of us can distance ourselves from those things to some extent. So is there any interesting work that tries to distinguish members of the population in terms of the, as it were, the effect of the ballistics on us, such that some are more likely to be knocked down than others?
100%, and it's such a sweet, helpful question. Thank you for asking me something that I couldn't stick into the talk, but there's just just so much cool stuff here. So the first thing to say, let me give you the theoretical commitments, and then I'll go through the individual differences. Theoretical commitment. Everybody has to believe everything in the first instance. Why am I saying this thing? Well, look, just as a methodological point, I think it's best to be as clear and flat-footed in every theory you put forward so that you could then be beat up along the details and, you know, what happened with Peter and I's back and forth, that's progress. That progress can only be made by me putting forward a flat-footed theory and then having somebody who knows more about it show you where it can't work. So do I think that this has to be the way that belief acquisition works? Sure. I'm going to say that everybody has to, so that all the individual differences have to come on the back end. Right. But, oh man, there are a lot of individual differences. So now the first sort of individual differences you can see is on, let's say, personality tests. So let me say, give you an introverted, extroverted personality test, where if you answer the first 50 questions right, and the first 50 questions yes, and the second 50 questions no, you're a perfect introvert. So I ask you questions like, do you prefer to stay home on a Friday night? And then I ask you questions like, do you like to be around other people? And that nobody is perfect in these questions, right, because we're all kind of inconsistent. Some of us are more susceptible to confirmation bias, but in particular, some of us are more susceptible to doing this thing, which is just yay saying. So let's call people yay sayers and naysayers. Now, there's just a natural difference between people who are yay-sayers and naysayers. And you'd be shocked to learn that naysayers turn to be, kind of people in this room. Philosophers are a big pain in the butt because we're trained to be like, no, that's wrong. But in fact, that's a general property that's just distributed. And if you put people under load, what happens is you move people, you just shift them towards yay-saying. So that's one way in which this happens. Another thing that happens, so you might think that that's something like gullibility. But then, in fact, I have this big line of research with, okay, so thanks to all these people, the collaborators, friends, former students, current students, with Nick Perot and Ryan Tracy, we have this, and Steve Young, another collaborator, we have this big project on bullshit. And it's a continuing project that Gordon Pennycook and others have had for who falls for pseudo-profound bullshit. And the people who fall for pseudo-profound bullshit often have lots of other interesting properties in common. So for example, they tend to not be great at what you might think of as, they're high in a scale of faith of intuition. So they believe that faith and intuition is the sort of thing like, you know, my intuition's good, and they fall for pseudo-profound bullshit. They're the sort of people who high in superstitious beliefs on the superstitious belief scale. And those are just, you know, interesting differences. Now, you might think that there's something deeper that has to be there, and there is the suspicion that, in fact, that they're worse at things like the CRT, that's the test of, like, a bat and a ball cost $1.05, the bat costs, a bat and a ball costs $1.10, the ball costs $1 more than the bat. How much does the bat cost? If the bat should cost $1 more than the ball. And so they're worse at those sorts of tests. They give the wrong sorts of answers. And so they're the ones that tend to be extremely gullible and fall for a lot more of what we, you know, the Deepak Chopra-ness. There's also just the, I take these to be separate factors. There's also, so you might think that's kind of a cognitive one. There's also a attentional one. How easy is your attention split? So there are people who are less apt to attend and more apt to attend. But then there's also environmental ones. So there's this evidence, it's terrifying evidence for those of us who live the way that some of us here live, which is that if you live in, let's say, more green environments, when you look at what they count, it's not really rural, it's kind of more suburban with more forests. That those who live more in nature are less distracted, have higher mood, and are better at processing information. And it's not shocking if you've read this paper that I have with Jay Quilty Dunn about something like why liberals shouldn't watch Fox News. That paper caused, you know, lots of problems for me. But one thing that the paper kind of suggested was that when you're in cities and you're bombarded with information, the problem is having multiple streams of evidence coming at you at once, and that you can't help but parse them and then take certain stuff in. And that's what Fox News and other, now every cable news does. Right? They give you the talking head and the cryon and then a crawl behind it. Those of us who live in cities like that are just constantly being bombarded and presumably have our ability to reject information lowered. Those of us who are insomniacs are going to have just less ability to reject information. And these are all separate factors that will cause individual differences. And you know, if I remember Sean Nichols once saying to me, the only thing, you know, the most interesting thing in cognitive science is individual differences. And he might be right, but if that's true, it's just like so hard. Because there's so many different ways for it to come.
Along different dimensions.
Oh, yeah, because none of those, I think all those dimensions are not correlated. They all seem more or less orthogonal. Yeah. Some of them are cognitive, some of them are where you live. So insofar as that's the case, we can hold on to the idea that some of us are better at this than others. And like, is that IQ? Like, no. Is anything IQ? It's unclear what IQ is ever supposed to be. But there is something to being a better believer and a worse believer. It's just, and the, you know, the great irony of it all, the like beautiful irony, is that insofar as I remember my Descartes, Descartes' method in the Meditations is kind of a good method.
Yeah, I was about to say exactly that. So I won't watch Fox News, not that I ever had any temptation to do so, but I don't have to throw away my rules for the direction of the mind.
Yeah, and like,
just read it carefully.
Yeah, you know,
don't overrate its power.
It's funny to set Descartes up as the true, you know, anti-hero of the story, and then to also say like, but you know, he had the right method for dealing with everything.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have another question, unless nobody else does. Sure. Okay. So this is a question about your claim that belief is the fundamental cognitive relation, and it might be because you distinguish between cognitive and what I at least would call conative states. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, do you think there's any symmetry here between beliefs on the one hand and things that we might call desires on the other? Because I would have thought those are pretty fundamental too. I'm not sure if they've got the same kind of course you'd expect them to have a different functional role, but I just don't see why. I wouldn't have expected belief would stand out relative to what we think of as the other co-equal partner that's necessary for action?
That's such a helpful question, and except for the fact that now I'm going to say things that are going to probably get people to throw tomatoes at me. So here's what I think tentatively. As part of a different picture, it's in the book that I'm going to be presumably just writing forever. So I had some of this in the talk. That if you believe P and you're given information that's consistent with P, it feels good. And that was the first time I kind of talked about that aloud, but this thing that I've talked about a lot elsewhere is if you believe P and you're given information that's not P, you feel really not good. And it doesn't matter how, what matters is how much you self-identify with that information. So if you're given information that's not P and it's something you don't really care about, so let's say it's the, you say that the capital of Nebraska is Lincoln, and I say, no, the capital of Nebraska is Kansas. And now we have, competing disinformation. You correct me. I don't care about what the capital of Nebraska is if I'm going to be that wrong about it, but you'll still see that I'm going to have some negative valence from it. But now, give me information that, in fact, about something I really care about. Give me some evidence that I'm dumb or that I'm immoral. You couldn't. Those are impossible. But no, if you give me, because that's the way we are. Right? No, those things, you could never give that sort of evidence. Or give me evidence that Lou Reed wasn't actually cool and didn't make great music. You couldn't do that because it's this thing that is like so central to the core of how I think about aesthetic properties and moral properties. And the more you try to do that, the more what's going to happen is it causes an immediate, negative, motivational state that is put into this dissonant state, that now I have to get this state to go away. And that is a basic drive state. And insofar as we are kind of looking at the history of cognitive science or coming from behaviorist theorizing, there was always a difference between drive states and what we might call desires. So I think there's something weird about saying, I desire to sleep, I desire to have sex, I desire to eat food. Those things seem like those basic drives that you don't desire to not be in pain. We desire to have beans with dinner. So insofar as we don't have to posit a desire to not be in pain, I think beliefs directly cause action, both cognitive and behavioral, based on their dynamics with consistent and inconsistent information. So I am not sure that we need desire at all.
I see.
I'm not saying that there is no desire, but I'm saying for me to think that desire exists in cognitive science, I want somebody to do what I'm doing for belief for desire. And I just want to add this other thing. I've said this to other people here before, but a general take on non-hard assery. I don't think that the only things that exist in the best sciences. I don't think there's a science of chairs. Maybe there is, but if there's not, I'll still believe in chairs. So if there's no cognitive science of desires, that doesn't mean I want to give up on desires. It just means that they're not going to be competing for fundamentality in this way.
You totally differ from Fodor on that point, I take it.
Totally. I mean, I differ from Fodor on most of these points. He thought that all the attitudes come as a package deal, and he also had no theory of how any of them are going to come. But I think if you're going to be a real psychofunctional, and he didn't look for any of the laws, right? This is the idea, and this is part of why it fell apart. But I think this is contingent, right? It just so happens that belief has this weird functional role. And I don't know the desires people, but they should be psyched. One day maybe I'll meet one.
But I guess I would have thought that, I'm just thinking about Hume's burning building example. Tell me that the building I'm in is on fire. I'm not going to do squat unless it's also the case that I care to survive. Now, if you call that a drive rather than a desire, then I guess I wonder whether we might be, you're holding off from that terminology because of sort of ordinary language considerations. And I might say, no, if we want to sort of re-engineer the concept of desire to include such things as drives, then that might, enable us to put them on a sort of beliefs and desires on an equal footing.
This is very fair. Here's what I think the real difference is. And this isn't an argument. This is just trying to do exposition. We all have to take something as primitive. And here is the rule of belief that I take as primitive, that I'm not explaining, I just think is part of the laws of how belief works. That disconfirming information hurts and confirming information feels nice. And I take it that's the real upshot of dissonance theory, and that you can do a lot to build things around that. Now, that said, it doesn't tell you what your beliefs are. I'm going to add to that people have core beliefs, that they're good people and they're smart people. I don't think people have the core belief that they want to continue existing. I think that that's something that some people have and some people don't have. And so I think that in this given case, it's just hard to know what to say, because you need to know what else is in the background of this person's mind in order to generate the behavior. And so anything, yeah, so that's the basics.
Good. Thank you.
I think we have time for a short question, Indrek.
Thanks for the talk. It's excellent. Bored with everything, psychofunctionalism. Love the whole stuff. I have a very boring question.
Oh.
But it's a way of relating what you talked about to the rest of what we're doing here. And there's this point when you said, oh, like, I'll call this belief, or, sometimes you say following Gilbert acceptance or whatever, but that's not judgment. Right? And I mean, in one sense of judgment, like, we can all agree that's not judgment. Like, when people in epistemology or in the doxastic deliberation literature talk about judgment, they talk about this super special thing where, like, it's making a theoretical decision. You weigh all your evidence, then you, like, come down on one side or the other, or you suspend judgment and decide to inquire further. And of course, like, it's clearly not judgment in that super rich sense, but that's not also like the sense of judgment that the judgment first people about content care about, right? That's like some super high level epistemological thing. We're not doing epistemology, we're doing the theory of representation. And in that sense, like, you could think, yeah, your acceptance or belief or whatever just counts exactly as what we call judgment in this other literature. And you might think that it's like you get a confirmation of the same fundamental type of view from two very different directions. It's like cocci versus, very coarsely put, like logic. The way you ever get any truth valuable content is via that very same operation. Like, it's not like, so this is sort of related to what Peter Hanks also asked you, did the entertaining part matter? Or that, like, you're supposed to be able to form the content before, like, it's automatic, but, like, are you supposed to be able to form the content where, there's all these arguments, like, you can't form the content without doing the forceful thing. And you could think, these two theories just confirm each other, sort of, or support each other. And so the question sort of is just, like, do you see any reason to think that there should be, like, a way of getting something truth valuable and not, like, as a separate step of the belief?
So let me just talk about the first setup. I mean, part of what's so beautiful about having invited me, thank you, Francois, is that this is how you get theories that are on firmer footing. Arguing with social psychologists from philosophy was this thing that I had done for a long time, and now arguing with philosophers' language is like a very helpful way of seeing that we're getting at the same things from different angles. I really appreciated a lot of the conversation with Peter yesterday to try to get me up to speed on what our disagreements might be, and the more we talked, the less the disagreements seemed to be anything but verbal things. I wonder, for this judgment too, I was thinking this during Francois' talk a lot about what judgment is, and the way to get at what disagreements we have is via functional role. So I think judgments, in my idiolect, is this thing that's effortful, that's done as an act of will, consciously, top down. And that all the stuff I'm talking about is about the basic machinery of the mind, so none of that stuff's coming in. But insofar as what we want to say is that putting together thoughts, forming the subject predicate to have a truth apt thing as a judgment, I'm on board. Like, if that's what Kant meant, I'm on board. Not understanding the difference, and like, I understand that I had to just use some words, and so I used judgment for this thing that was this latter thing of affirming or denying. That's just orthogonal, and that's why having these things is extremely important, to make sure that we're not just arguing and talking past each other.
Right. Yeah. Oh, you do.
Did you? I don't. I don't have anything to say about the last part. I'm not sure. I mean, if you want to tell me more about.
No, I just wanted to like ask a different question, which
Please,
is more,
please.
which is not as boring.
I
So
like
like, and it sort of takes off of like Mitch's question about desire,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, so you sort of say, okay, like, you know, we might find a way to get rid of desires. You know, maybe we're not getting rid of drives, but maybe there's just like not a propositional attitude or whatever. Like we should think of them in a completely different way or whatever. But one of the things you kept mentioning over and over is like the, you know, feels good, feels bad, right? And presumably that's not a matter of belief.
Mm-hmm.
That's just something like a different type of state altogether with its own functional role and like,
Totally.
you know, maybe some conscious quality or whatever. So I just wanted to say a little bit more about how you think about the feeling good, feeling bad part.
Yeah, so this is where there's like a big theory that I'm pulling on that I'm not adding to. I'm just taking on. It's another one of these theories that, like, you know, I used to think, what good is it to read history? And then everybody told me I was an idiot. Except for maybe Gil Harman, seemed to like that theory even more. But then for some reason I read all this history of psychology and the early behaviorist theories, which, you know, I don't know why I was doing. I think it was a dark time in my life or something. And what came out of it was like, oh, we had this one story of how behaviorism died. And that story was, you know, Chomsky comes along and says, look, syntax. But in fact, that is a very, very specific story that we're told because of where we are. There were multiple deaths for behaviorism, and many of them came from social psychology, which has its own very vexed background with them. I would say the main ones are kind of Milgram, but the one that stuck the most was Festinger from dissonance theory, in particular showing that reinforcements work the exact opposite way from what Skinner would have thought. And what was very cool about this upshot was this idea that when you have that you get this thing dissonance, which is a negative, phenomenologically salient, motivationally acute state. That is its own state of feeling a certain way. That feeling is negative, and that feeling is inherently motivating. So it's a form of psychological distress. And that psychological distress has a functional role in the same way that stubbing your toe has a functional role. It's pain in the same way that pain makes you want to avoid it. And the idea is that just like you know that when you stub your toe you'll be in pain, so we now know that getting disconfirming information will also make you feel in pain. And there's nothing more to say about the state of what it does on the back end other than it's discomfort. It's psychological discomfort. You just broke up with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, you're going to feel that discomfort in the same way that you'll feel this sort of discomfort. And that the interesting thing of it is that it comes from inconsistency, and I think syntactic inconsistency.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we should close this session. Thanks to Eric.
Mm-hmm.